I thought we were just celebrating. I had finally booked the corner table at Marcello's, the restaurant with the white tablecloths and the candles in little glass jars that my daughter Emma had been asking about for months. And everything felt perfect, the way things only feel perfect right before they shatter completely. I had no idea that before our dessert arrived, 2 uniformed officers would walk through that door, scan the room with practiced efficiency, and stop when their eyes landed on our table. On me. Not on the couple arguing quietly in the back booth, not on the man in the expensive suit by the window. On me, in my cornflower blouse, sitting across from my 11-year-old daughter, who had a forkful of carbonara halfway to her mouth. The moment froze in a way that I have never been able to fully describe. Emma's fork was suspended in the air. The candlelight caught the confusion spreading across her face like a slow tide, and I remember thinking, with the terrible crystalline clarity that only pure terror can produce, this cannot be happening, not tonight, not here, not in front of her. But let me start from the beginning, because to understand how I ended up sitting in a restaurant in my best dress, while a police officer asked me to step outside, you need to understand the 18 months that came before. You need to understand the house, and Jason, and his mother Brenda, and all the small, quiet, unremarkable moments that turned out to be something else entirely. My name is Clara Whitmore. At the time this story begins, I was 38 years old. I owned a small event planning business that I had built from scratch over 7 years of early mornings and late nights, and more spreadsheets than I care to count. And I lived in a 3-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane with my husband Jason and our daughter Emma, who was 11 and obsessed with pasta, watercolor painting, and a book series about a girl who could communicate with horses. Our life was, by almost any reasonable measure, a good one. Not extravagant. We weren't the kind of people who drove expensive cars or took cruises or talked about investment portfolios at dinner parties, but solid, honest, built with our own hands and maintained with genuine care. The kind of life that people sometimes describe as ordinary and mean it as a slight, but which I had always known was, in fact, exactly enough. Jason worked in logistics for a regional supply company. He left every morning at 7:15 without fail, and he always kissed me on the cheek beside the coffee maker before he left. Always said, "Have a good one, babe," in that distracted, half-present way that becomes as natural as breathing after 11 years of marriage. Comfortable. Unremarkable. Yours. We had a mortgage we could manage on our combined incomes, a daughter we adored with a frankness that sometimes caught us both off guard, a Friday night tradition of takeout pizza and whatever movie Emma picked, and a backyard with a garden that I had planted myself the summer after my mother passed away, filling the beds with lavender and rosemary because they were her favorites, and because grief, I have found, needs somewhere to go, or it will find its own way out. The house itself was mine, technically and legally speaking. I had inherited it from my mother 2 years earlier. A modest but well-built property that had been in my family since before I was born, that had seen me through childhood and adolescence, and every version of myself I had ever been. My mother had left it to me in her will, with a handwritten note tucked inside the envelope with the legal documents, for Clara, so she always has a place to stand. I sat on the kitchen floor and cried for nearly an hour after I read that. Then, over the following months, I repainted the kitchen in the warm cream color my mother had always wanted but never gotten around to choosing, put new tiles in the downstairs bathroom, refinished the hardwood floors in the hallway, and made it, carefully and deliberately, mine and Jason's and Emma's. Jason's mother, Brenda, had made her feelings about the house known from the beginning, not in direct statements because Brenda was constitutionally incapable of directness, but in the small, precisely calibrated ways she had spent decades perfecting. She had visited in the first month after we moved in and spent 45 minutes cataloging imperfections with the detached thoroughness of a building inspector who has no emotional investment in the outcome. The crown molding in the living room needed repainting. The kitchen faucet had a slight drip. The spare bedroom was, in her estimation, a wasted space that could be put to much better use. She delivered each observation with a small, sympathetic sigh, as though the inadequacies of the house were a burden she was graciously helping me to recognize. She never said the house should belong to her. She never said anything so structurally vulnerable to challenge. Brenda operated in the architecture of implication, in the particular tonal register of phrases like, "Of course it's your home, I'm just thinking aloud," and "I don't mean to interfere, but don't you think?" Phrases designed to land like criticism while remaining technically, defensibly kind. I had been managing Brenda for 11 years by then. I had learned the landscape of her personality the way you learn the layout of a dark room, by slow navigation, by memory, by the minor collisions that teach you where all the sharp corners are. She was not, I want to be clear about this, a cartoonish villain. She was not a monster in any obvious sense. She was a 63-year-old woman who loved her son with a possessiveness that had calcified over decades into something she had likely long ceased to recognize as unhealthy, who had raised Jason alone after her husband left when Jason was 9 years old, and who had, I believe this sincerely, never once in her adult life asked herself whether her desires might be less important than another person's autonomy. Not out of cruelty, out of a kind of profound self-reinforcing certainty that her feelings were simply the correct ones, and everyone else's were in need of gentle correction. In the months before the dinner at Marcello's, I had been unusually preoccupied. A corporate client had approached me to plan their annual gala. 400 guests, a downtown venue, a budget larger than anything I had handled before. And I had said yes with the slightly terrified excitement of someone who knows they are capable of the thing they've just agreed to and is not entirely sure that knowledge is enough. I was living at my laptop in the evenings after Emma went to bed. I was on my phone during lunch, during the school run, in the parking lot of the supermarket. I was in spreadsheets and venue walkthroughs and vendor calls with the kind of immersive focus that makes the rest of life slightly blurry around the edges. Emma understood, with the quiet graciousness of children who have good mothers and know it. Jason said he understood too, and for the most part he appeared to, though there were evenings when I looked up from my laptop and found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite classify, something contained, something that hadn't quite decided whether to speak. I told myself he was tired. He said, when I asked, that he was proud of me. I believed him because I wanted to, and because we are all, in the end, most vulnerable to the lies that require the least effort to accept. Emma had been suggesting Marcello's for roughly 3 weeks by the time I made the reservation. She had read about it in a school newsletter, a small piece about family-owned restaurants in the area, and she had mentioned it with the patient, methodical frequency of a child who has identified what she wants and is simply waiting for conditions to become favorable. When the gala contract was signed and the deposit cleared, and I sat back in my office chair and felt for the first time in months like I could breathe properly, I called her into the kitchen and told her we were celebrating, just the two of us, girls' night. I made the reservation 3 weeks in advance. I bought the cornflower blouse from a shop downtown that I normally walked past without going in. I told myself, "You are allowed to mark this. You have earned this evening." I should have paid more attention to what happened 2 Sundays before the dinner. We were at Brenda's for the fortnightly lunch that had been a feature of our marriage since its early months, an obligation I had learned to approach with the cheerfulness of a professional who knows that some situations require performance rather than feeling. Brenda had made a roast, which she always did, and the table was set with the particular formality she reserved for Sundays. The good china, cloth napkins, the crystal water glasses that she pointedly did not use when she was displeased with us. That Sunday, the crystal was out, which should have made me less suspicious, not more. We were passing the bread rolls. Emma was asking about whether birds could taste spicy food, a question she'd read about somewhere and was deploying at the table with complete seriousness, when Brenda, with the careful casualness of someone who has rehearsed the timing, said, "Clara, have you sorted out the property tax situation on your mother's house? With the inheritance, I mean. It can get complicated." I remember the question arriving with an odd quality, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise familiar piece of music. Property taxes were not a Sunday lunch topic. They had never been a Sunday lunch topic. I looked at Jason, who was cutting his roast with his eyes on his plate. I said yes, everything was handled, up to date, the solicitor had seen to all of it. Brenda nodded slowly with that particular quality of focused attention that I would later, in hindsight, recognize as the look of someone cataloging data. She said, "Of course, good," and reached for the water, and the conversation moved on to Emma's question about birds, and I let it go. I should not have let it go. A week later, on a Wednesday, Jason came home 40 minutes later than usual. The lateness itself was not alarming. Traffic, a late meeting, any number of ordinary explanations were available. But he had a quality when he came through the door that I had learned to recognize over 11 years. A stillness, a slightly overdone normalcy, the manner of a man who has decided not to say something and is working at the effort of not saying it. He kissed me on the cheek. He asked whether Emma had finished her homework. He said he'd grabbed a sandwich at the office and wasn't hungry. He went to bed before me, lying on his side facing the wall, his breathing slow and deliberate in the way that means someone is awake and performing sleep. I lay beside him in the dark and listened to the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and told myself, with patient, practiced gentleness, "He is stressed about work. You are projecting because you are exhausted. Not everything is a warning sign." I had spent 11 years being very good at that particular form of self-management. The dinner was a Thursday in November. I remember the cold vividly, that specific dry November cold that gets into the gap between your collar and the back of your neck and makes the warmth of lit interiors feel like something you've been given rather than something you're simply entering. Emma wore her green corduroy jacket with the small embroidered bee on the pocket, the one she had chosen herself from a market stall in September and worn approximately 4 times a week since. She was talking as we walked to the restaurant, hands moving to illustrate her school art project. A watercolor of a forest at dawn, with light coming through the trees, describing the exact shade of gold she was trying to mix and why it kept coming out either too yellow or too orange, and how her art teacher had suggested starting with white and building up the warmth in layers. I walked beside her and listened and felt, with a completeness that momentarily silenced every other noise in my mind, exactly as happy as a person can reasonably feel on an ordinary Thursday evening. Marcello's was warm and quietly busy. The waiter, a young man with a pleasant manner and a faint ink stain on his right forefinger, seated us at the corner table I'd requested and brought a basket of warm bread and a dish of olive oil without being asked. Emma pulled a piece of bread with both hands and dipped it immediately and without any self-consciousness, and I ordered the linguine with clams, and she ordered the carbonara, and we clinked our sparkling water glasses. She had insisted on sparkling water because she decided it felt more like a proper celebration. And she said, "Congratulations, Mum," with a gravity and sincerity that made my eyes sting in the very best possible way. We were halfway through our main course when the door opened. I felt the shift before I saw it. There is a very specific quality to the attention a full restaurant gives to two uniformed police officers walking in from the cold. A brief collective recalibration, a reorientation of faces, a quiet communal awareness that something has entered the room that is outside the register of ordinary evenings. One of the officers was a woman, brown hair pulled back neatly, expression professionally neutral in the particular way that communicates nothing and therefore communicates everything. She scanned the room once. Her eyes stopped at our table. She said something to her colleague, a heavy-set man with a broad, still face, and they walked toward us together with the unhurried certainty of people who always arrive where they intend to go. Emma had put her fork down. She was watching them approach with the wide, curious attention of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of police officers and is simply interested in what happens next. I stood up. I do not know why I stood. Some reflex older than reason, some animal instinct that being upright was better than being found seated, small, motionless, unable to rise. "Clara Whitmore?" the female officer said. "Yes," I said, and my voice came out thin and strange, like a signal received from somewhere very far away. "I'm Officer Reyes." She glanced at Emma. A brief, deliberate softening, the professional adjustment for a child's presence. "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions. Perhaps we could step outside for a moment?" The November cold hit me like a physical fact the instant we were through the door. I wrapped my arms around myself over the cornflower blouse and looked at Officer Reyes and made myself breathe, slowly and deliberately, through the white noise that was gathering at the edges of my hearing. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "we've received a formal complaint regarding the property at 14 Birchwood Lane. The complaint alleges that the deed of ownership was obtained through fraudulent documentation, specifically that a forged codicil was added to your mother's will after the original was filed, redirecting ownership of the property away from its rightful heir." She paused. "We're not here to make an arrest tonight. This is a preliminary inquiry, but we will need you to attend the station to provide your documentation and make a statement. Do you have legal representation?" The world did not spin. It narrowed. Very slowly, like a lens tightening its focus to a single bright point, until all I could process was Officer Reyes's face and the sound of my own pulse, which had relocated into the space directly behind my ears and was beating with a heavy, deliberate certainty that felt like dread given rhythm. Forged codicil, redirecting ownership, rightful heir. "That is my house," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "My mother left it to me. The will was filed with the solicitor. I have a certified copy. I have the deed of transfer. I have every single document." "I understand," Officer Reyes said, with the careful neutrality of someone trained to neither confirm nor dismiss. "The complaint names a third party as the legitimate inheritor, a Ms. Brenda Calloway. there it was. I stood on the sidewalk outside Marcello's in the cold, in my celebration blouse, and I heard my mother-in-law's name come out of a police officer's mouth attached to a claim on my home. The home my mother had built her life inside, the home where my daughter slept under the same roof that had sheltered me as a child. And something happened in my chest in that moment. Not heat, not the wild, ungovernable fury I might have expected. Something much colder, much more focused, the kind of cold that a fire leaves behind when it is burned all the way down to coals. "I see," I said. I went back inside. Emma looked at me with her sharp, perceptive eyes. 11 years old and already more observant than most adults I knew. And I sat down and smiled at her and said there had been a small mix-up about some paperwork, nothing serious, nothing she needed to worry about. I asked if she wanted dessert. She ordered the tiramisu. I sat across from her and watched her eat it and kept my hands flat on the tablecloth so she wouldn't see them shaking. I did not call Jason that night. I sat with that decision consciously, deliberately, turning it over in my mind like an object I was examining from every angle. Brenda Calloway, a forged codicil, a formal complaint filed with the police, and Jason, who had come home 40 minutes late 2 weeks ago with that quality of performed stillness. Jason, who had watched me with compressed, unreadable eyes over his plate at Brenda's Sunday lunch, while his mother asked about my property taxes. Jason, who had said he was proud of me and gone to bed early and lain with his back to me, pretending to sleep. No, I was not going to call Jason. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly how deep this went. I drove home and put Emma to bed and waited until I heard her breathing slow through the half-open door, and then I went to the box on the top shelf of my wardrobe where I kept the documents that mattered most: the certified copy of my mother's will, the deed of transfer, the correspondence from the solicitor 2 years earlier. I spread them on the kitchen table under the bright overhead light, and I read every word, slowly, with the concentrated attention of someone who is no longer reading for reassurance, but for evidence. Everything appeared correct. Everything appeared exactly as I had always known it to be. My mother's signature, the solicitor's stamp, my name, written on the deed in firm black letters, as clear and final as a door being closed on an argument. I took photographs of every page with my phone. Then I sat at the table, in the silence of a house where my daughter was sleeping, and my husband had not yet come home. It was past 10, and I had not heard from him. And I opened my laptop and searched for the best property solicitor in the city. Jason came home at 11:17. I heard his key in the lock. I heard him move through the hallway with that particular quiet of a person trying not to be heard. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and saw me sitting at the table with my laptop and the spread of documents, and he went still in a way that told me, with an immediacy that landed somewhere below conscious thought, everything I needed to know about whether he was surprised to find me awake. "Clara," he said, "you're still up." "A police officer spoke to me at the restaurant tonight," I said. I kept my voice level. I had decided somewhere on the drive home that I was not going to raise my voice. Outside Marcello's, while Emma was inside eating her tiramisu, a police officer told me that a formal complaint has been filed, claiming I fraudulently inherited my mother's house. The complaint names your mother as the legitimate heir. I looked at him. "Where were you tonight, Jason?" Something happened to his face. It was not simple guilt. It was something more complex and more terrible than that. It was the expression of a man who has been dreading a specific moment for a very long time and has just arrived at it. and finds that it is exactly as bad as he knew it would be. He crossed his arms. He looked at the floor. He looked at the documents on the table, and then looked away from them, quickly, as though they were something he could not quite bear to see clearly. "She came to me," he said finally, in the voice of someone choosing words with the exhausted care of a person navigating a minefield they have partially helped to build. "Months ago. She said she'd found something, some paperwork, that she thought your mother's solicitor had made a mistake with. She said there was a version of the will that had been filed incorrectly, that there was a codicil your mother had always intended to include." He stopped. "A codicil naming your mother," I said. He didn't answer. "Jason." My voice was still quiet, absolutely quiet, in the way that a room goes quiet when everything unnecessary has been removed. "Did you know she was going to file a complaint with the police?" He pressed his lips together. He uncrossed his arms and crossed them again. He looked at the corner of the ceiling in the particular way that people look when they are trying to find a version of a true thing that is less damaging than the truth. "She told me she was going to explore her options. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't think she would actually go to the police. I thought maybe she'd talk to a solicitor, and the solicitor would tell her she had no case, and she'd let it go." "You thought," I said, "or you hoped. And while you were hoping, you said nothing to me." The silence after that was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that kitchen. He stood in the doorway. I sat at the table. The refrigerator hummed with its usual indifferent frequency. 11 years of marriage, 11 years of cheek kisses by the coffee maker and Friday night pizza, and the garden I'd planted for my mother, and he had known his mother was constructing a legal assault on my home, on my mother's home, and he had decided, in the privacy of his own calculations, that the path of least resistance was to say nothing and hope the problem resolved itself without requiring him to choose a side. "You knew," I said. "You knew what she was building, and you let me plan a celebration dinner while she filed a police complaint about my house." He didn't deny it. That was, in the end, what I had needed to know. "Call her," I said, "right now, tonight, and tell her that I know everything. And then tomorrow morning I am going to a solicitor, and if there is a single forged word attached to this complaint, I will pursue it through every legal avenue available to me, and I will not stop, and I will not be managed, and I will not be quiet about it. Do you understand?" He nodded. He took out his phone. I watched him dial. The solicitor I found was named Margaret Osey, and she was, as I later told Rachel over the phone at midnight, exactly the kind of person you need in your corner when someone has come at you with manufactured paperwork, precise, methodical, entirely without sentimentality, and possessed of a comprehensive knowledge of property law that she deployed with the quiet confidence of someone who has won this exact argument many times before. I sat across from her on Friday morning, 48 hours after the restaurant, and laid every document I had on her desk and told her everything, and she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "The codicil they've submitted is dated 3 months after your mother's death. That is not a legal codicil. That is a forgery." She said it the way you state a fact about the weather, without drama, without flourish, simply as a thing that is verifiably true and requires action rather than reaction. The investigation that followed took 11 weeks. Margaret coordinated with a forensic document examiner who confirmed that the handwriting on the codicil was not my mother's, that the paper stock was inconsistent with the claimed date, and that the solicitor's stamp had been digitally reproduced from the original will. The formal complaint was dismissed. Brenda was interviewed by police twice. She was not criminally charged. The threshold was not met, Margaret explained, though the evidence of fabrication was unambiguous. What was met, thoroughly and without question, was the civil threshold for malicious complaint, and Brenda was ordered to pay my legal costs in full, along with a damages settlement that I did not expect. I deposited it, with a feeling I could not quite name, into an account I opened in Emma's name. Jason and I did not separate. This is not a simple thing to explain, and I will not pretend otherwise. The weeks that followed were the hardest of our marriage and the most honest. Conversations I had been avoiding for years finally had nowhere to hide, and some of them were worse than I feared, and some of them, in the end, were better. What came out was not the marriage we had before, but something rawer and more deliberate, built on a clearer understanding of where the weaknesses had always been. He had known his mother was dangerous in that specific way. He had chosen for years to manage her at the expense of protecting me. He understood, fully, finally, without the mitigation of excuses, the cost of that choice. I chose to let him earn his way back. That was my choice to make, and I made it with open eyes and a clear head, not out of habit or fear. Brenda I have not seen since the civil hearing. I do not expect to. It is late spring now. The lavender in the back garden has come in early this year, full and dense, and a deep purple gray in the evening light, exactly the shade my mother always loved and never quite managed to get right with paint. Emma is working on a new watercolor, a kitchen table with a vase of lavender on it, the light coming through the window at a low angle the way it does in the late afternoon. She has finally cracked the gold she was after. White first, then the warmth built up in layers, exactly as her teacher told her months ago. She showed it to me last week, holding it at arm's length the way she does when she is proud of something, but trying not to let it show too obviously. And I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the painting for a long time without saying anything. The light in it was very good. It looked exactly like a place where someone was safe. My mother left me a house so I would always have a place to stand. What she also gave me, without either of us knowing it at the time, was the reason to fight and the absolute, unshakable certainty that some things are worth every cost of defending. I lost some things in the year that followed that November dinner. The comfortable ease of not knowing. A version of my marriage I had believed was simpler than it was. The particular naive trust that the people who sat across from you at Sunday lunches, eating your food and drinking from your crystal glasses, were not quietly planning how to take everything else. What I kept was the house. What I kept was Emma. What I kept was myself. Clearer, harder edged, no longer willing to talk myself back from the ledge of my own instincts. The lavender is in. The painting is beautiful. I still have the place to stand.